Without further ado, it's my great honour and pleasure to introduce our first panellist. So our first guest is a maths PhD and a statistician and a senior staff writer for The Economist, but she's currently on a sabbatical to write a book on gender ideology, one of the great thought leaders of the movement and someone I've learned so much from. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Helen Joyce.
Well, thank you, Leisha. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm back actually off sabbatical, and the book is now finished. It's being copy edited, and I'll be announcing very, very soon when you can buy it and so on. So I'm really happy to be able to tell you first before anyone else, my own home people, where I'm at on that.
Thanks, Helen. So you're one of the thought leaders in the field. What first made you sit up and pay attention to what was happening, to the impact of gender ideology, and what made you become gender critical as well?
So it's interesting, isn't it? I think for most of us, there's been a narrative all our lives, wherever we are on the political spectrum, there's a narrative that, you know, we're extending rights to more and more new groups. And most of us are very for that. So I think that's been a huge reason why a lot of this has flown under the radar, is that it looks at drive-by speed like it's the next civil rights movement. And I suppose 3 or 4 years ago, before I started to think about it, I didn't think about it much. That's how it would have seemed to me. You know, you had an oppressed minority who had said what they needed for civil rights. I was a bit sort of nervous or suspicious, or something didn't sit right with me as soon as I looked at it a bit more closely than that. And for me, you know, as with a background in mathematics, the sort of central issue for me was this very circular definition, like a woman is anyone who says they're a woman. Something about that bothered me straight away. But it's hard to put your finger on what, isn't it, when everyone around you seems so sure that they've got it right. So I kept sort of nagging away at it. And then I was asked to write an article about it. And mostly I don't write about this for The Economist. I have a quite different job. I'm the deputy foreign editor and haven't written about it for a good while. But it's other people I've written about it for. But anyway, somebody asked me to write about it. And I started to look at it, and I just got actually extremely worried. That was when I started to realize that, you know, they really meant it when they said that saying you're a woman made you a woman. I had sort of assumed it was just a polite fiction, and this is a way of, you know, accommodating people who I'm still really happy to accommodate. You know, if people are really unhappy and people need special accommodations in any society, we can look at that. We can look at ways to do it. There's no reason, blanket reason, that we can't look case by case at different situations and say what's possible. But that wasn't what was being done. What was being made was an ontological claim that what makes you a woman is saying you are a woman. And then, you know, you don't have to be very imaginative to think about the sorts of settings where that's just not going to work out, like prisons, like sports, just like changing rooms, you know. I mean, these things aren't on the basis of what you feel like, they're on the basis of your physicality. And then it seemed extraordinary to me that people hadn't registered that. And then I got quite enraged. And then when I discovered that they were medicalizing children, that was when I really lost the plot completely and decided that I really had to write a book about this.
Now, you're obviously, you were a journalist and are still a journalist. I remember being in journalism school, and been taught that the importance of the fourth estate, that it was imperative that, you know, it was one of the pillars of democracy, and its role was to hold power to account. Now, that might be a little bit idealistic, and probably Noam Chomsky has disproved that. But overall, how do you interpret the role of the media in all of this as a journalist? And also, second part of the question, sorry, in, you know, the media here in Ireland is sort of fully captured. These issues, the whole issue is treated kind of from the first person in sort of featurey lifestyle stories about trans-identified people, which is all very well, but we need to look at practice and policy. But so how did that happen in the UK? What do you think, when you look back, what helped some brave journalists start to cover this properly in a grown-up way?
So first you have to ask yourself, don't you, why didn't all journalists cover it properly? Like, journalists are meant to, you know, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, and all those sorts of things that journalists say about, you know, news is something that someone somewhere doesn't want me to print. And it's extraordinary the extent to which journalists have abandoned their traditional practices. And I think you can go back about 20 years and look at the long run history whereby journalism became a graduate subject, and the sorts of subjects that people studied at university were those that have been, in my opinion, corrupted by ideology in the last 20 years. So people study the liberal arts and the humanities and the social sciences, all of which have been hugely captured by a way of thinking that isn't about truth or just concrete reality or practicality, but is incredibly ideological and that sees words as tools of ideology. So you don't think to yourself, how can I make life better for the sorts of people who are described by words that I've always used in certain ways? You think, how can I change those words to make what I want to happen seem like it's already happened? And they maybe don't put it quite that way, but that is really what they're doing. So journalists changed. They became graduates, they became much more ideological, and then at the same time, money went out of journalism. So there's much less in the way of investigation. A lot of outlets, not the Economist, thankfully, have got rid of older, seasoned reporters. They've brought in younger people that they think will do more digitally. They're looking for more clickbaity type thing because as advertising got lost, people had to try and bring people in. The Guardian, I think in particular, has had a huge issue here in the UK, which is that as it stayed free, its reader base has moved largely to the US. And the US has this extraordinarily polarized political system whereby, everything is right on one side and everything is wrong on the other. And which side is right or wrong just depends on where you sit. So these forces together meant that journalism stopped doing what should have been its job. Now journalism is more basically a sort of a feel-good propaganda and a way of saying that the world is already what the person who's writing wants it to be, as opposed to actually just reporting what's going on. And then there are all these separate sorts of institutional capture. Like, it is extraordinary that the established women's groups haven't had more to say about all of this, because they're the people who should have pushed back. But that's another part of the story, is that people like Stonewall, like Forces Society here in the UK, see their role in a very different sort of way. They're kind of part of the establishment now. They're not what they used to be. If you think about the way that they got set up, like how Stonewall gets set up, it's very much the way you did. They saw a huge problem, they saw an issue, ordinary people said, I can't let this go, I have to get out there and I have to speak. Well, those people are now comfortable chief executives who, cycle from one charity to another and pat each other on the back and are proud of their institutional capture. They're not people who are driven by a mission anymore. So I will stop in a minute and I'll let you ask me another question, but I do want to say that the thing that makes me most positive about what's happened is the way that I'm seeing this incredible rushing of energy and renewal that's coming out of the stale, capture and, almost corruption, like intellectual corruption of the old order. I really think that we're not going to be able to rescue some of the institutions that should have done this work, but we are going to replace them, and it's things like this that are going to make them be replaced.
Yes, I mean, that reminds me of in Ireland, the official our women's council is now controlled by a male, trans-identified male, pushing that agenda. So yes, I think it's true. These institutions can become like husks compared to what they were set up to do. Can you tell us a bit in terms of your research and findings, how this came about? It feels like it's come out of nowhere, but obviously this was all put in train, maybe 20 years ago. Can you tell us a bit about that, the sort of meta timeline, if you like?
So I think first off, it's incredibly important not to sound conspiratorial about this. There is no sort of Illuminati behind the scenes that is controlling this. And when we name individual organizations or people, we're not saying, oh, they're sitting there plotting in some sort of seedy way. It's not like that. There's 4 or 5 sort of forces that have converged, and some of them are quite long run. So there's no way that you could have thought of somebody being trans-identified until the doctors started to do operations. And that's pretty much exactly a century ago now, a little bit less than a century. But once that started, you kind of opened a door that could never be closed again, which was that you could change someone's body. Someone could be more than a cross-dresser. So before that, people had cross-dressed, and some people had lived in the opposite sex roles, mostly women, by the way, women who actually wanted the freedoms that they couldn't have as women. Mm-hmm. So, women went off and fought in the Civil War. James Barry, an Irish woman from Cork, registered in Edinburgh to train as a doctor and then was a doctor for the rest of her life because she couldn't do that as a woman. But when you could start doing operations, and the first ones were all on men, you could imagine something as being beyond cross-dressing. And the doctors had an ideology that was that sex was a spectrum and that you could move people along that sex spectrum. Now, it's nonsense. Sex is not a spectrum. We all know that. Let's not rehearse the ideas. Everyone, here either knows that already or has decided that I'm a massive bigot for saying it, but sex is not a spectrum. It's binary. But that was the way they presented it to their patients. And if you fast forward about 50 years, you've got some transsexuals. And some of those transsexuals are people who have an enormous psychological need not to be seen as living as members of the opposite sex, not to be accommodated, but to be seen as really members of the opposite sex. And because this is such a narrow goal and such a legalistic goal, it looks a bit like a civil rights movement, but actually it's not. So civil rights movements require you to bring everybody, or at least lots of people, with you. You know, women had to persuade men that women deserved the vote, because in the end it was men who had to give it to them. Yes. And black people had to persuade white people that slavery was an abomination, because it was white people who were going to have to end it. Well, you don't have to, if you're someone who's trying to make gender self-identification or some version of that the law, you don't really have to persuade many people, you just have to persuade the legal system. And so actually it's a lobbying movement rather than a civil rights movement. And the urge for it comes from these individuals who very much want to make it happen, some of whom are quite powerful individuals. I mean, they're rich white American men. And some of them are just institutions that were looking for other causes. Mm-hmm. So in particular, when gay marriage was one, it's very important once you become an institutional charity that you've got a new cause. Now, actually, what the gay rights charities should have done is they should have started to worry about countries where we're still hanging and stoning and decapitating gay men. That's what Stonewall should be worrying about. It's just that they happen to be, you know, in Iran or Pakistan. Or we should be worrying about grassroots homophobia. You know, there's so much work that could be done in certain communities in England, but those things don't get you, you know, a baronetcy or lots of money from donors the same way that gay marriage did. So they were looking for another marquee cause, and along came this offer of gender self-identification, and they all pivoted.
And do you feel that Ireland was chosen to become one of the few self-ID nations? I mean, we were the third country after Argentina and Malta, but, you know, from your research, does it feel to you that we were picked out to become sort of the poster child in many ways?
No, not exactly, although you are the poster child. We are the poster child. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Argentina and Malta do not have Ireland's friendly, cuddly, you know, we're nice to everybody sort of image on the global stage. Like, if you wanted one country to do gender self-ID so that you could say everywhere else, you know, Ireland is great, I'm absolutely certain they were trying lots of places. We were the muggins, you know, we were the fools who fell for it at the same time as gay marriage and a bunch of other things. So there's a sort of an international relay race, and this really isn't just about trans issues. This is a kind of policy-making thing. Like, globally, there are lots and lots of people between academics and charities and think tanks and NGOs who, on any given issue, are trying to maneuver to see how best they can get what they want. And, you know, that's kind of fine. But they're very right to do it that way. But it tends to be that you create international bodies that put forward best practice, or you tell one government that somebody else has done something and that worked very well and that's best practice and they should copy it. And, you know, that's the way you play it. And this has very much happened with gender self-ID. So the sort of spine of all of this is these two strange documents that are named for this Indonesian city that I've learned how to pronounce properly. It looks like Yogyakarta, but it's actually said Yogyakarta. So the Yogyakarta is a tourist city in Indonesia. And in late 2006, a bunch of people met mostly to discuss gay rights, because they can't do much on gay rights at an international level because all the international forums have countries that are just not going to do anything on it. So the idea of this one was to create sort of strategies and model documents that could be used individually in national campaigns. But there was a bit of stuff there about this new thing, gender identity. And they created this new acronym, SOGI, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And the document that was published in 2007 yokes the two of them together, and all the way through says these two things need to be legislated. And they used the most extreme law of the time, namely the Britain's Gender Recognition Act of 2004, as their model for everyone. That was the only law at the time that didn't mandate surgery before changing legal sex. Fast forward 10 years, and idiots here have gone for gender self-ID all in one big step because of, you know, offers of best practice, and they did it in Argentina and so on. And we and the other two have got used as the examples that everyone else is meant to copy now. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they use the baseline as the norm in these sort of lobbying efforts. So why did we fall for it? Do you know, we had a lot else going on. I think we would have fallen for it in the UK too, but a bunch of things kind of intervened, namely Brexit. Like, we were all set to just put it into law. There was a government proposal to do it. It had been passed through the relevant committee. It was women who were putting it forward. It was the Women in Equality Select Committee. And then Brexit kind of slowed everything down and gave time for the organisers to come in. So you're having to fight an action to overturn something, whereas they were lucky. They were given a 4 years delay and they were able to organise and just by the skin of their teeth stop the law from changing.
Now, in Ireland, we face exactly the same law as Biden has just brought in with his executive order, which is an amendment to equality legislation to amend it to include gender identity as a grounds. We view this very much as the meta template trans law, as in it will very likely, in all likelihood, obliterate single-sex provision for girls in this country without the need of a gender certificate, gender recognition certificate. Can you tell us a bit about your research into the Equality Act in the UK? Now, there is a slight difference because in Ireland, we are even more on the back foot because we don't have sex as a grounds, we have gender. So we're already weakened. But can you tell us, with that caveat, can you tell us a bit about your research specifically about gender legislation in the UK?
So there are two laws with the same name. One is the UK's Equality Act, which passed in 2010, and then there's this proposed legislation in the US, which has the same name but is very different. So the UK's Equality Act in 2010, it has its flaws, but in concept, it's quite a model. It brings together about 100 different sorts of laws and court rulings and so on into a single overarching framework for equality and discrimination law. And it lists 9 protected characteristics. 2 of which everybody can't have. One of them is pregnancy and maternity, and the other one is disability, but the others are all in principle things that all of us have. Like everybody has a sex, everybody has beliefs, because it includes lack of belief. Everybody has a race. It doesn't say, that you can't discriminate against women. It says you can't discriminate on the grounds of sex. You can't discriminate on the basis of belief. And then it sets these out, and it also sets out exceptions and ways that you can resolve conflicts. So the classic conflict until the latest issues came along with gender identity would have been between people who were of conservative religions and gay people in the workplace. So that would have been the meat and drink of the sorts of Equality Act things that arrived in employment tribunals. And it has been already established that both of those people have rights. You can't tell a conservative Muslim or a conservative Christian that they must go, rah, rah, I love gay marriage. They don't have to. They can be conscientious objectors to that. What they can't do is infringe on the rights of a gay colleague or harass them, and rightly so. The gay colleague can't insist that everybody signs up to thinking that gay marriage is right either. So that's the sort of overarching idea. Everybody has rights, everybody has characteristics. Sometimes these butt up against each other. None of them wins out over any other. Everything has overarching aims. Employers can't be expected to accommodate absolutely everything. They can't, have to spend absolutely loads to accommodate a particular disabled person, but they should make reasonable accommodations. And one of those characteristics is not gender identity. This is really important. It's gender reassignment. Now, it's very vaguely defined, but it's still meant to be something objective. It's not a statement you make about yourself. It's a process you're going through. And so if somebody comes in and says, I want to present myself as a woman from now on, that you can't be sacked on the basis of that, and rightly so. The question is, how does the employer accommodate it? What's reasonable? How might that infringe upon other protected characteristics, such as sex, which is a protected characteristic? Now, all of this has been thrown out the window a bit because of the lobby groups like Stonewall, which tell flat out lies to employers when they give them advice. I mean, they tell them, for example, that gender reassignment changes your sex for the purpose of what facilities you're allowed to use. It absolutely does not. Someone who has the characteristic of gender reassignment has to be accommodated, and that's right. It doesn't change their sex. They don't have to be treated as a member of the opposite sex because in law, they're not. In law, the only people who are members of the opposite sex are those who change their sex with their legal sex with the Gender Recognition Act. And that's only about 5,000 people. And even then there are exceptions. So the law says you don't have to admit women who are legally women because they have changed their sex into certain sensitive spaces or into women's sports or that sort of thing. So as a law and as a way to frame it all, it's quite a model. Really, people have many characteristics and these require accommodation in services and in employment. And you have to think about everybody and think about trade-offs and conflicts.
It's really, really interesting. Yeah, it's always important to remember how in Ireland we have the law that was brought in by stealth, but then we are seeing the beginning of public capture, policy capture. Whereas in the UK, you stop short of that law because you had those years to organise. But
Exactly.
you have de facto self-ID because of a misinterpretation of that law.
Yes, but these legal cases, and we've got a lot of them this year, and you're going to be hearing from Maya. She's got one of the very important cases, because Maya is hoping to, she'll tell you more about it, but anyway, she's hoping to get it recognised that her beliefs, her feminist beliefs in the immutability and consequentiality of sex are a protected characteristic. And in that case, she's been illegally discriminated against. So that's one of the cases. Kira Bell, her judicial review of the Tavistock. There's a bunch of other important cases. There's one about female prisoners with a male prisoner who assaulted one of them, moved in with them. It's 5 or 6 cases, and all of them can make it be that we have to return to the law as opposed to this overreach. One of the most important ones is Alison Bailey against Stonewall, whom she alleges that Stonewall essentially colluded with her employer to get her fired, and fired for reasons that are to do with her being a lesbian and with being a woman. Namely, that she was one of the people who founded the LGBT Alliance, which hopes to replace Stonewall as a proper representative of gay people in the UK. So even if she loses, as Alison may, because it's a complex case, she's alleging indirect discrimination. She's getting the most explosive material out into the open domain. Just a couple of days ago, this letter that Stonewall wrote to her employers, in effect saying, nice legal chambers you have there, will be a shame if anything happened to them. About Alison. That's now in the public domain, so people see what's going on.
I mean, I think the more court cases that can happen, the better, because this is then said in court, and it's everyone can see it. Likewise with the Kira Bell judgment, which was just a beautiful piece of jurisprudence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. First time.
I was really struck by what you said about, that what we do here on the ground in Ireland is like what Stonewall first did. And, I always think about the fact that, the Irish government didn't cave to demands of trans people, trans-identified people, because they were marching on the streets protesting. This is very much, this gender ideology is a top-down ideology, which has just seeped into the mainstream culture. But yes, it's before we finish up, is there anything you would like to, what message you would like to give to activists on the ground in Ireland as kind of one of the thought leaders of the movement in the UK? And you're at a different stage of the timeline, and obviously there are some differences, but what can we learn, what can we apply to what's happening here?
I suppose it's going to have to be person at a time now that the law is there, isn't it? I mean, things generally should be. I'm actually a big believer in things having to bring everybody along with them. I remember people saying things like, it's not right that other people should have the right to vote on whether I have the right to marry. But look at what happened. We got such an amazing result. It brought the country together. And now there's nobody who can deny that Irish people want gay people to be able to marry. So I think, in a way, it's daunting to say we have to bring everyone along with us, or a lot of people along with us. But you know what? That's how everything durable happens. And it's also upsetting to think just how shallow women's rights really were. But, we can't look back. We can only look forward, and we can only look to our sisters and get strength from each other. And every person who, people only move in one direction. And so I'm seeing a couple of the questions pop up, and one of them is my book title. So it's
I was going to ask you that. Are you allowed to tell us the name?
Yeah, Trans from Ideology to Reality, or When Ideology Meets Reality, I beg your pardon. So that's the face-off, isn't it? There's people who say how the world should be, and there's people who go, well, look, we're mammals. There's mammalian but biology, and then there's these weird queer theory ideas about what makes you a man or a woman. And that's, I suppose, the final part of what I'd say to comfort people. When you have reality, as in bedrock physical reality on your side, you do have something very strong behind you. Female people won't be wished out of existence by us pretending that you can call males females. We still exist. And so people only move one way.
Yeah. And I think as well, we have to remember that women are 50%, females are 50% of every population.
More, we're 52%.
52%. And we all live in democracies. So it's about making our presence felt, making our voice heard. We will be heard. And also, I totally agree with you. It's my opinion that 9 out of 10 people agree with our stance. Our stance is not fringe or radical.
Oh, not at all. That's why they silence us. They silence us because as soon as we say it, I had a private lunch that I wasn't allowed to report on, and with somebody who was very senior in a university gender studies department. She said so many turfy things without realizing it. You know, it turned out she didn't know that men were being locked up in women's prisons. And when I told her, she went, "Oh, well, you can't really be doing that. And, you know, well, you should keep the rapists out anyway." And you're like, you're a TERF. You just don't know it. So yeah,
Exactly.
really nearly all of us are. So once you get through people's belief that we are bigots, and they realize that, you know, the other side really genuinely mean males should be allowed into women's sports, males should be allowed into women's prisons, and so on, everybody agrees with us. You really have to have gone down the rabbit hole not to.
Yeah. Thank you. That's just so clear as ever. I'm so grateful
Well,
to
thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy that this is happening in Ireland, because I've been looking across the water and thinking, when are you going to get going?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Some just brilliant insights as usual. And please stick around. Come back at 4:30 for the Q&A.
And thank you to everyone who said, buying the book, buying the book. That's what I want you all to do, to buy the book.
We all will.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, Helen.